Hello, my lovely cryptids, and welcome to another episode of Stories with Siren. I'm your host, Siren, and today we're going to be delving into my spooky playlist. This story is one that I personally wrote, and it's called Be Fat. It was inspired by a piece I saw floating around the internet. Just a quick glance, but a woman sitting at a table in a 1950s dress, a man behind her. And of course, my mind went to all the dark possibilities. Now, before we get started, I would strongly recommend checking the description if you're concerned that a story like this might not be for you. Understand that it is dark, it is a little bit disturbing, and, well, not all stories have a happy ending. So, without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? Be fat. That's all he said. His voice was like velvet in her ear, wrapping around her brain and sucking her into the vortex of his will. He leaned over her shoulder in his three-piece suit, all suave and perfectly put together. His hand fit perfectly on her shoulder as she sat at the table, a feast set out before her. She looked up to him, the spoon already in her hand. When they'd married, she'd worried for days over everything. She'd promised to be a good wife, to cook and clean, make sure the house was spotless for him when he came back from work every day. She had tried her best to please him in every way, submitting to him and giving her all. But something had always been missing. And now that he had said those words, and her eyes were open to the feast before her, she understood. This is what he wanted. This was how she could be perfect. And so she ate. She ate every bite before her movements still polite and dainty, but her desire had grown, the desire to eat, to grow, to be fat. And even as she ate, she could feel him behind her. She could feel a sense of approval and pleasure emanating from him. He saw everything, and he approved. A day passed into a week, and she found the greatest pleasure in what she saw in the mirror. No more girdles to cinch in her belly or keep her silhouette slim. His hand slid over her sides, her hips, her belly. Even without a word, she could feel his pleasure. It was written all over his face as he stood behind her, letting her see his fingers stroking the newfound plumpness of her belly. Even when he wasn't home, she found her day moving differently. No longer was she spending hours on her feet, scrubbing the floors in her pearls and dress. Instead, she wrapped herself in the softest silk robe and ate bonbons. Her soap operas were on, and she felt the most comfortable resting on the couch with her feet up. She was doing exactly what he wanted. Be fat. There was no other desire in her mind. She could do what he asked, what he wanted. The week quickly became a month. The mirror showed her progress, her change. Her limbs had become fat and flaccid. Rolls had gathered along her once slender arms, and pocked cellulite gathered on her hips and thighs. Her belly, once thin and toned, rolled over her undergarments. She stared into the mirror, lifting a heavy breast with a hand. He was not here for the moment. He was at work, her perfect provider, and she wondered if she had fulfilled all his desires. The house was not shining and spotless, but it was clean enough. And every night when he returned, his hands trailed over her flesh. Those strong hands slid beneath the silken robe, exploring and roaming, her warm rolls of fat filling his hands. She did not have the words to ask him, but she looked deep into his eyes and saw his desire. Be fat. It wasn't long before a month became a year, and she finally felt at her best. She felt the weight of his pleasure around her like a warm cardigan. He had made the one request of her, and she had been happy to do it. Those simple words, be fat. And she had embraced it wholeheartedly. Her stomach pinned her to the bed she had shared with him. Her breath was shallow and rapid, but joy was on her face whenever she felt his presence. He was quiet as ever, but the warmth of his regard always made her heart speed. This day, he stood before her, a smile on his face. His hands measured her in silence, moving her feet to her head. He reached her lips and kissed her, his kiss deep and demanding. Never had he expressed such a lust, but it thrilled her. She was wanted as she had ever been. He slowly disengaged from the kiss, taking a step back, and standing before her, he slowly removed his vest, his long, slim fingers undoing one button at a time. Once it was unfastened, he settled the garment on a chair and turned back to her, still steps away. With the same precision, he unbuttoned his shirt, the warm, lustful smile never leaving his lips. She watched him, her warm body encased all in fat, still a quiver. She could only imagine what he wished to do with her, but something else crept over her. For a year, she had been driven forward with a single thought, be fat. And now that driving force had slipped away, drawing away from her mind like spiderwebs. Her purpose over the last year had been stolen from her, chilling her to the bone. Other thoughts began to filter in. She did not have a purpose. And yet, the purpose of being the perfect housewife returned. Yet how could she? She was too fat to leave the bed. Her wide stomach covered her as an apron, and her thighs and buttocks weighed her down. Her arms felt like lead, weighed down with such heavy rolls of fat, and her fingers had become sausages. How could she sweep the floor and take care of the house? How could she provide meals for her husband? He stepped forward again, his eyes heavily lidded, his smile taking on an edge she had never seen before. As if in answer to her unspoken question, he came to her side and settled his hands beneath her chin and behind her neck. He looked as though he understood, and that he was pleased. Something in that gaze promised that she would do everything he needed. He spoke again, his voice soft and yet somehow sharp. You were fat. Well, wasn't that a delicious little treat? Interesting how the monsters can be those that we see in our day-to-day lives, those whom we want to please. Well, that's all for now, but until next time, ta-ta.